Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a good week. This week we're going to be going over a couple of different things, but I actually want to start this week by going over response paper number 1. I know I already had one student email me asking me a few questions, and I think it's really helpful to sort of go through the document in a video. And then, of course, you're more than welcome, if you still have questions, to please email me after watching this. Okay, so as you all know, this is due September 20th at the end of the day, obviously on Canvas. And you can read all of the possible points and all of that fun stuff. Please make sure that you do have an introduction and a conclusion that are really short, so that your body, which should be about a page and a half, your body should be obviously the longest section. I will also say that you could go to 2 to 3 pages. So if you want to go longer, that's fine, but don't be short. 2 is like bare minimum. Don't give me 4 or 5 pages either. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of an idea about the intro, but what you're trying to do with this paper is you are going to be writing about yourself. So you're going to be writing about your own culture and your experience interacting with a culture. So in that introduction, make sure that you tell me clearly what culture you've chosen, because many of us identify with many different cultures. And I want to encourage you to think outside of the box here. So yes, of course, you can use your ethnicity if you want, but you could also use a culture like, for example, I could write about being a teacher, right? So I could write about teaching culture. You could write about skateboarding. You could write about maybe being a fan of a certain type of music. Maybe the culture of business. Whatever it is you want to write about, I think is awesome. And in fact, I almost prefer that you try to think outside of the box, because then I usually learn more about something that I didn't know a lot about. But again, it's totally up to you. Just make sure you're picking one culture and tell me why you chose this culture. And that's totally up to you. And then, of course, preview in the introduction what you're going to say with the rest of your paper. So after that, your first paragraph or so should tell me a little bit about your positionality within this culture. So what I mean by that is, if you're talking about being a part of the teaching culture, right, your positionality is the ways your multiple identities affect you being within this culture. So for example, for me, one thing that affects me being a teacher is that I actually don't have, I have like six or 7 years of experience, maybe 8 at this point. But that's something that I could write about as far as my positionality in the culture, because there are plenty of people who have 20, 25 plus years, and that really affects the power dynamics that I have with those people in that culture. I could also talk about being a woman in this culture. In a teaching culture, typically being a woman gives you a little bit more power, although when we're talking about it in higher education, that really depends, because there's a lot of research shown that students tend to be more critical of women. Another thing I could talk about is being white and being a teacher. All of those things are parts of my positionality. And then when you talk about those things, reflect on things like, do you have a lot of power? And why you think you have a lot of power, or why not. There isn't really a right or wrong answer here, but what makes it right, I guess what makes for a good paper is that you're really explaining your experience. So you're giving me a lot of details about your experience rather than being very vague. So then the next section, after you tell me your positionality, you're actually going to talk about the ways that positionality affects the way you communicate with those within your culture. So that first section, you're just talking about your positionality and whether you have power or not. Second section is, okay, since I don't have a lot of power, when I interact with someone who's been teaching for 20 or 25 years, or who does a lot of research on this, I'm a little bit intimidated, right? That might not be the case for you, right? Again, this is all about you writing your experience, writing about your experience, okay? The third one, and this is where it can get a little bit confusing, but what's really important here is that you are going to describe your interactions with people of one other culture. So what I mean by that is, if you've chosen teaching culture, then you're going to choose someone from maybe the rural community, right? That would be my other culture. I've chosen that because I'm very familiar with that because my family is in that community. And I know that when being a part of like academic culture, when I communicate with them, there's a lot of differences that we have, right? So I've picked that because I can write a lot about that. I know that there's some weird power dynamics here. So here what you would do is sort of maybe even talk about like which culture has the most power in our society. You might talk about whether it's really complicated communicating with that other culture or whether you find it to be really easy, and explain why that might be the case. So again, what's really important here is that you're not being vague about the other culture that you've chosen. All right, so you don't just say, well, when I'm a teacher communicating with people outside of this culture, that's not specific enough. Okay, I want to hear, sorry for the loud noise. I want to hear some specific details about one other culture. And this culture should be something that you are not a part of or that you're pretty disconnected from. Okay, and then of course have a conclusion here. Make sure, and this is really important, make sure that you're using at least one of the readings to illustrate your points. For full credit, you're gonna want to use quotes from the reading, so that's really important. And no reference page required for this paper unless you use an outside source. Outside sources do not get you extra credit, so I really do want this paper to be about yourself and not a research paper. But don't forget to use the course. And then the last thing I'll point out to you is I do have a rubric that's more detailed in the document that's posted on Canvas rather than like in the assignment section. So if you go to this document, you can find it under the Files tab on Canvas. You can see, you know, sort of all the things that I've explained to you here. You can see that I require quotes from the text, connects to key concepts, all of that stuff. And don't forget that when you do your assignments in this class, when they're worth 25 points or more, you should grade yourself in the little comment box. So if you forget to do that, I mean, that's totally fine, but grading yourself could only help you. So look at this, and then by the end, if you say, okay, I did all of this stuff, you can give yourself a perfect score. You can also give yourself a perfect score if you feel like you didn't do all of that, but you will probably have looked at this and been like, oh, I forgot to actually choose only one other culture. So I see why I might miss some points when she does eventually grade me, okay? All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit more of an understanding of what I want from this paper. And as always, you can feel free to email me. I'm always happy to give you any sort of suggestions or help in any way that I can, okay? All right, so with that said, I want to shift gears a little bit before I start talking about the readings for today. And here I'm bringing up the PowerPoint for that. I do want to just quickly give you some feedback on your participation points post from last week. So most of you did really well replying to at least 2 of your classmates and giving them some suggestions on ways that they could use the intercultural praxis for some of those intercultural conflicts that they had. So as most of you said, something that becomes really difficult when we're thinking about using the intercultural praxis is that the person on the other side might not be using that, right? So this is sort of putting a lot of burden on you, right? And I think in some of the posts that I responded to, I didn't respond to all of them, but some of them, I told you that, you know, some things, sometimes you can choose to just not act. You can choose to step away, right? And so you should only go through the intercultural praxis and use it if you feel like it's worth your time. Right, I know a lot of you are in the business school, so sometimes you are going to have to do that to, you know, make the sell or make the partnership or whatever it might be. But sometimes when you're doing interpersonal conflicts, you're realizing that, you know, maybe this isn't someone I'm interested in being friends with. So then you can step away. So it's totally up to you. I'm not trying to say you have to use it every time. It just can be helpful to continue to build a friendship or a partnership with whoever you're trying to work with. All right. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the readings for today. So I'm going to start with the globalization chapter from the Sorrells textbook. So here's a few things that I'm going to make sure that we go over. So first of all, we're going to start by talking about power, which is related to one of your reading questions. And then we'll talk about those 3 types of globalization. And I tried to get you guys to see the negatives and the positives here, but I want to make sure that you understand all 3 of them. Okay, so here's the big American flag with the bald eagle and, you know, making some of us feel very patriotic. But I posted this up here because when you think about the role of power in intercultural communication on like this big macro level, power can affect the way people see you when you go to engage with them, right? So that can be either good or bad, right? So if you maybe come from a culture that is very skeptical of, if we're using this slide, the sort of Americanization of the world, then that particular person, if you are an American, that particular person might be skeptical of the relationship that you're about to have, right? If they actually like the Americanization that's going on and they feel like that's really helped their country or their culture, then of course it's going to go the other way around. But on like a more micro level, this can be like as simple as the fact that your professor has more power than you, and how some of you might feel intimidated to come to office hours or to ask a question through email. That's another way of thinking about how power affects our engagement with people from other cultures, right? So it doesn't have to just be, I know for some of you, you spend a lot of time thinking about language, right? And how if you don't know the language, then of course it's going to be hard to communicate, right? Yes, that's true, but it's also hard to communicate if you have different power levels, right? Okay, so most of you sort of got that. I just want to make sure I expanded on that a little bit more. The next thing I want to do is I want to move to the 3 ways that intercultural communication is affecting the world globally. So the 3 different ways are economic, political, and cultural. I'm going to go through each one relatively quickly because I know you have the book and they give you even more details there. And the history that they give to you is really, really important. But because I don't want to make this video way, way long, it's already going to be long, I'm going to sort of overlook that history for to save time. Okay, so we're going to start with the way that this is happening economically, right? So what your book talks about here is they talk about how we have a lot of corporations that are going from country to country, so multinational corporations, right? And this can be both positive and negative, right? So in some ways, having these businesses, like for example, Starbucks or McDonald's, is really nice, especially if you're someone who goes from place to place and you travel a lot, because for us, because we're familiar with Starbucks and McDonald's, we then have something familiar, even though it does shift a little bit, right? But we have something familiar that we can go to when we're doing our travels throughout the world, right? So that can be a really positive thing. It can also be positive because, of course, that opens up economic opportunities for that particular business, right? On the downside of things, and this is something that your textbook gets into a little bit, well, sometimes these corporations going into other countries, like for example, maybe Walmart, and even in different parts of actually the United States, when those corporations go to some places, they end up affecting small business, right? And so these small businesses that are run by typically locals in the community might see a big impact and might end up losing money, or perhaps even eventually have to shut down because Walmart came to the area. Right? And I mean, that's a disaster zone scenario, but I'm just trying to give you a couple of different ways that this can be positive and negative here. And then the other thing, of course, and this has become more popular when we're thinking about the Pacific trade deal that was going to happen a couple of years ago, that didn't actually happen. But something we have to consider is the idea of free trade, right? And who really wins out when we're talking about free trade, right? So I know that the textbook gets into that in more detail, so I'll leave it at that. I want to move next to one of the other ways that intercultural communication is affecting the world, and that's politically, right? So I've talked a little bit about Americanization, which is something that will come up culturally, but Americanization is connected to something called democratization, and that's moving the democratic political system to other parts of the world, right? So the United States isn't the only country that's involved in democratization, but it is one of the bigger ones, in fact, the biggest one. And the idea behind this was that there are political theorists who believe that if we have all countries under a democracy, then that means those countries are not going to go to war with each other, right? So that they have this similar political system, and they're not going to go to war with each other. Other political theorists are sort of skeptical on that because it really does depend on what sort of democracy that you have. And they're also skeptical in sort of spreading democracy in some places because some places, some people think are not quite ready for democracy, right? So some people believe that, or especially the democracy that we have in the United States, right? Some people think that it needs to be a little bit more solid, right, before we allow for democracy. And then another perspective would be that if you know, in some places like, I think a recent example would be Egypt, right? They say that they're a democracy, right, in order to get approval. But if you look at what's happening, people question whether it's actually a democracy, right? So this democratization has created a lot of political problems. And it's also sort of trickled into this, to ideological wars, where sometimes democracy is attached to getting rid of religion in the political system, right? And so that's something that's really created ideological wars with especially some nations that are strongly attached to Islam, right? And so I think here in the United States, we are attached to Christianity, whether we like to admit it or not. But it's hard to imagine, like, we're not as attached to Christianity as some countries are attached to their religion. So it's hard for us to imagine how difficult and heartbreaking it would be to see your religion just detaching itself. And that's led to mistrust on both sides. Okay, and multiple sides, not even both sides. All right, so the last one, and I'm saying a lot that, like, if we were in class, we would be able to really engage with, but I'm just trying to give you some things to work with. So the last one I want to bring up, and this is the third one, is that intercultural communication affects the world culturally. And I've already said this happens through Americanization. And Americanization is sort of happening on all of these different levels, to be honest, economically, politically, but more specifically culturally, right? So Americanization, when we have like a McDonald's go to a specific neighborhood in other parts of the world, like let's say Mexico City. The idea of like fast food, right? And, or actually Paris is a better example because Mexico City is sort of fast paced. But if we take it to Paris, right? Paris has a culture where they sort of take a lot of time when they eat. And when we're bringing in fast food, that affects the way that they consume food, right? Yes, of course, the McDonald's that are there serve food a little bit differently. But if you go there, they still have that structure of like, in and out as fast as you can, right? In fact, when I was lucky enough to go, they had like little computers where you could just order on your own, which is something I hadn't experienced in the United States. So it was even faster when I was in France, which I found interesting. And the other thing when we're talking about the cultural way that globalization is affecting the world, is there's something called deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So think about this as taking something from one culture and then bringing it to another. All right, so I'm going to say deto. So deto is taking it up. Like a good example would be taking sushi from Japan. Right, so I've detoed that. Now I'm going to reto it to the United States. And what ends up happening with that deto and reto is that there's a shift in whatever thing was taken to this new place, right? So you all have probably heard of the California roll, right? That California roll was a result of this process. So I've given you a positive. I'm sure that, I mean, there are plenty of positives and plenty of negatives of this, but this is a important process when we're thinking about what's happening culturally with globalization. Okay, so I know I've given you a lot to work with so far. I'll skip hybrid cultures because we'll have plenty of time to think about that throughout the semester because I want to move us on. Okay, so we're gonna move from the Sorrells textbook. And so I've talked about power, I've talked about those 3 types of globalization. Where I wanna move to next is we're gonna use the course reader number 1. And I'm only gonna focus on the questions that I gave to you, even though there's a lot of stuff you can use from this particular reading when you're thinking about communicating with people of other cultures, especially when you're thinking about other cultures who are in other parts of the world. But something that's really important when you're considering all of this is that not everyone from this culture is going to function in the way that we expect them to. Right? And so something that you have to keep in mind with intercultural communication is even though you can do so much research and try to figure out what the people are going to be like before you meet them, sometimes you're going to be wrong, right? A good example of this is like if you grow up in the middle of nowhere in a small town versus if you grow up in Los Angeles in the United States, you're probably going to move at a faster pace if you grew up in a big town, right? Rather than in this small rural community. So if you were from that rural community and you went into, let's say, Japan, and everyone expected you to be fast-paced, you would confuse them perhaps, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is try to avoid that confusion. Don't assume too much of the people going into your intercultural engagements. All right, so I know that the textbook talks about all of these things. We're gonna focus here on fast and slow messages. I might quickly talk about high and low context because those things are really important too. And then finally, I won't talk about space, but I will talk about time because there was a question about that one. Okay, so the first one that we should get into is fast and slow messages. So I think all of you got this right. I might be wrong, but almost all of you got this right. Here in the United States, we are a fast message culture, and you were all very descriptive with like the examples that you gave. But one very specific example would be the fact that many of us prefer to get our news on social media rather than prefer to get our news with like a newspaper getting that in-depth story, right? So something that becomes really interesting is like if you're from Germany, so this is the leader of Germany, I think Prime Minister, Angela Merkel, and then you're President Trump, you're coming in, she's slow, sorry, she's from a slow message culture, and he's from a fast message culture. And it can become really difficult because what will end up happening is she takes a lot of time to make her point. Right? You might sort of relate to this by like, because I'm from an academic culture, that's more of a slow culture. So I do take more time to make my point because I'm trying to make sure that as many people as possible understand, right? And so that can lead to conflict if you don't realize that in advance. But I would like to think that both of them sort of knew that there are going to be different cultures, but you never know. All right, the only thing I'll say about high and low context is that we are pretty low context. So in other words, we need people to tell us what they want from us. Whereas the Japanese or people in Latin America are high context. And in other words, what this means is that they expect you already to know how you should be communicating with them. So a good example of this is like if you go to Japan and you don't take off your shoes and perhaps people were upset, they're sort of looking at you, but they're not really telling you. That's because they're from a high context culture. And we sort of get confused because we're way down here. All right. The last thing I want to talk about before we wrap things up is monochronic and polychronic time. So yes, as I think most of you know, we are a culture that typically runs on monochronic time. So in other words, we have this sort of linear understanding of time where we want people to be on time. We want to make sure that people are paying attention to one thing at a time. and we don't like to be interrupted. There are other cultures that are polychronic, which is really hard for some of us to understand, because what happens is if they're in like a business meeting and someone comes in to interrupt and then they start doing something completely different, that's actually, that's normal. But if we're from a monochronic time frame, we are like, weren't we just talking about this really important thing that we should be focusing on? And so of course that can lead to intercultural conflict. The only thing I'll say about this is that I would say that we are moving closer to being more polychronic, partially because of so many of us being on the internet all the time and doing all of these things all at once. And so I think that perhaps we might be shifting closer to being polychronic and not as monochronic at this point. But, you know, like communication changes, so does our relationship with time. All right, so that's all we have for this week. Thanks for watching the whole video. I know it was long. Please make sure that you do the participation points at the end of the week. You're going to need this video to help you through some of that. And then I'm also going to be emailing you in the next week or so about getting into podcast groups. So if any of you are interested in being in groups together and you don't want me to put you into groups, please let me know through email so that I can make sure that you're in the groups that you want to be in. Otherwise, I'll just choose randomly and we will see how things go. All right, thanks again. Have a good week.